Today we have a preview for you for a nice little game based on Rummy. This one's called Dungeon Rummy. It's from designer Fel Barros, who we know from his days back at Simon. He has his own studio now called Samba Estudio, and this is their first game, and it is effectively cooperative Rummy set in a dungeon dive sort of experience where we're going to be fighting these monsters all the way to a boss monster, but you're doing it, like I said, cooperatively, which is a different twist for Rummy.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting twist. If you're not familiar with Rummy at all, it's a card game that uses a normal deck of cards where you're drawing cards into your hand and trying to play them out in front of you to make what they call melds, which are sets which are a bunch of the same card, or runs, which are a bunch of cards in a row. And you're doing that in this game as well, except every player is going to have their own deck to draw from and that shared discard pile. So when you're drawing cards, just like in Rummy, you're drawing a card from the top of the deck or you're drawing from that pile. The only difference is there are some restrictions on those sets and runs that are not there in regular Rummy, and I think that's where the big twist of this game comes in.
Yeah, it's interesting because each of our decks, and no matter what the player count is, you're going to be playing with all four characters. I'm Bob.
Yeah, I was
Lily.
Lily.
Milton, Oki, and Lily.
Yeah.
These are typical classes that you might expect, clerics, fighters, so on. And they're all going to have powers that they can gain through tokens. But they're each going to have their own deck, which is effectively the suit. So I have yellow cards. No one else has yellow cards. And what Ryan was getting at is as we play these sets or runs, there are some specifics. When you play a set, none of the colors can be repeated. So the most cards you're going to play in a set are 4. The runs have to have alternating colors of some kind, so you can't have 2 of the same color adjacent to each other. So if you have a 2, 3, 4, 5, the 4 and the 5 can't be the same color, which makes it a little tricky. We're playing these also, not just in front of our own play area, but each character is going to have their own play space. In this game, since it's just the 2 of us, I'm playing Bob, you're playing Lily, but Oki and Milton are companion misfits. We're all misfits, but these are our companions. Their decks are face up, and we can, on our turn, utilize potentially some of the cards we see in their decks.
Yeah, and playing to other people's play areas is very key to the game because David just listed off those restrictions. David can't play 2 cards in a row of the same color. So he needs the other players to come in and play the cards. If he lays down the 3, then he might need us to lay down the 4 so that he could play the 5. But you're doing all of this without any communication about exactly what's in your hand. So David can't say, well, I've got the 4, 5, 7, and 8. I need somebody with the 6, and then we can say, oh, well, who has the 6? No, you're communicating via the way you're playing. And when you have less players, don't worry. You can still use the cards of the other companions. Like David said, they're face up. And you have these little boot tokens that you can use on your turn and effectively turn them face down to play the cards from the top of the companions decks as well. So we can kind of look ahead. And maybe I want the ace to be part of my set or part of my run or whatever. And then David sees that and he knows, okay, well, I can see you're building this run. I'm going to add some cards to it with the goal of getting a certain number of cards. You can kind of, I don't want to say push your luck because it isn't really, but you can kind of build those sets and runs as big as you want. Well, I guess the set can only be 4 cards, one of every color. But the runs can get bigger and bigger. And the reason you want to do that is because all of the cards you're playing will eventually convert to damage.
Yeah, everyone's turn is going to start the same way. The monsters attack, then you draw a card, then you're going to play your actions, and the actions is the meat of the game, and then you're going to discard 1 card to sort of the communal discard pile. But when the monsters attack, you're going to look at the face-up monster in the middle of the table, and in the upper left-hand corner, it basically details what's going to happen on their attack. In this case, the active player is going to take 2 damage and an additional damage for every card that is in the graveyard, which is the discard pile. So after that, then they're going to draw a card, and in this case, there's no card here, so Ryan would take right off the top of his deck. Then he can play all of his actions. This includes a number of things, which is playing those cards into the different play areas. You can only play 1 meld in each of the play spaces, but you can use those boots. You can move cards around. The boots not only can be used, like Ryan said, to play cards off the companion decks, but you could flip a boot to move a card from one play area to another. So even if you've started a set or a run in one area, if you've got a much bigger opportunity, but you really just need that 7 that's in the middle of all the 7s, you can take it and add it so that you have a much bigger thing to execute. and executing those melds is another thing you can do. Any meld can be done so. It has to have at least 3 cards in it. So once you do that, like Ryan alluded to, each card is going to be a point of damage done to that monster. This one needs a total of 10 done to it to kill. And if you have a run of 7, it's called a canasta. And if you have a run of 7 with no wilds, which we haven't even talked about, it's a royal canasta. The canasta is going to give you a bonus of 3 damage and 3 mana. Mana is an interesting thing that we haven't talked about because that's going to be a little icon on top left of some of the cards that you play.
Yeah, and when you're turning in these sets and runs, when you're doing damage, you're looking at that. You're looking at how many of those diamonds you have, and each one of these classes gets something. For example, Oki and Lily, each for every single mana they have, they get a bonus token. Oki gets the ability to heal, and Lily gets the ability to shield people. It gets a little bit harder. Bob wants 2. For every 2 mana, he gets the ability to have somebody draw a card. And Milton, for every 3 mana, gets to have somebody, gets to give somebody a wild token that can just replace a card that you need for your set or run.
And this is also tied to why you want to play melds from certain characters. Because if we really need to heal, we're going to want to play our melds in front of Oki here so that we can get healing tokens back. We might not need to draw cards, so there's no need to really try to play cards or melds into my area necessarily, but that's going to change as you play the game.
Yeah, and that's just another thing that feeds into the decisions you have to make when building these sets and runs, because that really is, like David alluded to, the meat of the game, but the strategy and the puzzle of just constantly moving these things around. Because if it wasn't clear, you can't fire off a set or meld unless it's legal. So as you're playing, like, you might move cards from one set to another, but you might not want to because you realize, oh, if I take this card away from you, we're losing that 3rd mana, we're not getting the wild anymore. Or if I add a card to yours, I'm not, I can't add it to mine, and like if I move a card that makes my set illegal, now I can't even use it. Somebody has to come in and fill it. And that is where those wilds do come into play. David mentioned that there are wilds. It's the 2 value card has a little question mark. That means it can be used anywhere. But what's really cool is if it's being used somewhere to kind of fill in a blank and somebody draws that blank, they can replace that wild with the actual card that's supposed to go there and then move that wild somewhere else. So again, cards are moving and passing back and forth these different play areas quite a bit during the game.
Yeah, and a lot of that depends on how many boots you have. In a 2-player game, we each have 4, but those are going to be more evenly distributed the more players there are. So you can really use those boots to make some things happen. Otherwise, you are just playing cards out of your hand, off of any companion decks, moving cards around and whatnot, and then potentially firing off one of those things. And when you do, and you get enough damage on a monster to defeat it, you're going to get a treasure that's in the upper right-hand corner. The cards that we have here all have 1, but the rulebook alludes to maybe more treasures on some. You're going to flip that treasure token over and put it in sort of a loot area. These can also be used on your turn at any time. You can say, oh, you know what, I'm going to use this. You just discard it to sort of a dead zone and use it. Then the next monster is going to be revealed. Now, the monsters have a bunch of different things. First of all, their attack is going to be different. This one does 1 damage, but it does it to all the misfits. Some other ones are going to have another ability in the middle that might say, as long as that monster is in play, for instance, you can't play your own cards or other cards during your turn to your play area. So it kind of forces a little bit of cooperation, if you will, but makes it a little bit more challenging. And then you're going to work your way all the way to a boss monster. And the boss monster, at least of the ones we have, often have multiple stages. This one is going to do a pretty nasty attack, but also stage 1 is just 10 health. But once you do that, it triggers stage 2 and then stage 3. And in this case, I can tell you, this icon here, since it's this specific creature that's kind of like a gelatinous cube, but a slime.
Yeah.
Inside it, there's another monster, and stage 2 is to pull that monster from the deck and put it out here, so you have to defeat another monster, basically.
Yeah, it kind of has that feel of progressing through almost like a campaign game. But you are kind of having to manage not just your deck, but like everybody's deck, because these are almost like standard decks of cards. You have more cards in there than you might have for your particular suit. But once cards are used, once they're used to fire off those attacks, they are removed out into like what you would call that dead zone. Yeah. And they stay out there until you need to reshuffle. So as you start to fight through this chain of enemies, and when you get to the boss, it really helps to know maybe what's gone and what's been used. If you're trying to build a set of sevens and all the sevens have been played or a bunch of sevens have been played, you start to realize maybe that's a bad idea. So it definitely does benefit to kind of planning out what you want to do without talking about it.
It's
really.
definitely a puzzle to solve built around a rummy mechanism for sure. But it does become challenging. And even in our first play, you can play this game and feel like, okay, we're doing all right.
Yeah.
But you're all the while taking damage. And you're almost always taking some amount of damage. And a lot of them will add damage depending on how many cards are here. So if you're not drawing from the discard pile, it just means the next player or companion is going to take that much more damage. And by the time we get to the boss and you look down and like, oh, we're all pretty close to dying, so this is going to be challenging. You definitely have to take into account early on, okay, let's do some damage, but then let's also try to get some of that mana so we can have some tokens to spend along the way. There is a limit on the number of tokens each player can have, but I think it's like 7. But you're definitely going to want to get a supply of those by the time you get to the boss.
Yeah, and again, that kind of works into the teamwork. And we didn't even really talk about that discarding aspect of the game because you have to discard, at the very end of your turn, you have to discard a card. But that discard could be quite a signal to somebody because the next player in line could pick up that discard if they want. So you can almost use that, you could pass a wild or you could pass a card that they might need to play on their turn as well and just kind of help that chain keep going as far as the teamwork aspect.
And you can even communicate a little bit, not so subtly. The communication limitation is really specific to talking about what's in your hand. I can legally go, boy, I sure would like a 7 to be played.
Sure.
If anyone could do that, maybe. So you can say things like that. Maybe someone can put that out there if they don't know exactly where you want them to play it.
But you can't just sit and talk about, okay, well, here's what my hand is, here's what your hand is.
You don't lay them all out on the table and go,
figure out the
let's
perfect.
do that.
No, it's not. You're not going to have the perfect sets and perfect runs every single time because you really don't know what your opponent needs. But there are so many different ways of suggesting or hinting or asking or even just as you're playing, it's kind of obvious, okay, I'm building a run where I might go, okay, well, I've got the 5. I'm using a boot to get this wild to make it a 6, and then there's my 7, right? And then it's very clear on David's turn that he can just say, okay, well, I actually have the 4 or the 8 or even the 6 that he can use to kind of build that out.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting because the puzzle can actually evolve quite a bit, particularly with the companions when you're playing off their deck. It just gives you more options. You might play a card and they're like, oh, well, there's another card. As long as I have a boot, I'll do this and add that card as well. But doing that from one deck becomes tricky because of those color limitations in the sets and runs.
That is the real trick because you start to draw your hand and you're like, ooh, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. And then you realize, oh, I can't play all those.
Yeah, we made that mistake right off the bat.
Yeah, you just want to lay it down.
Oh, well, here you go. Boom. It doesn't work
that way.
No,
you really, really have to rely on your teammates to come in there and fill in those literal gaps.
Yeah, so that is Dungeon Rummy. If you have any questions at all about it, go check out their Kickstarter. It should be running around the time this video drops. But if not, get down in the comments below and ask us whatever you want. We'll try to get down there and answer whatever we can. Until next time, make sure everyone has fun at the table, and we'll see you then.